The dusty streets of Tombstone, Arizona echoed with an eerie silence as Marshal Jake Hartwell rode into town that scorching July morning of 1887. His weathered hands gripped the reins tighter than usual, not from the desert heat, but from the gnawing uncertainty that had been eating at him for weeks. The advertisement he'd placed in the Denver Post had been simple enough: quiet, God-fearing woman sought for marriage, must appreciate solitude and simple living. What he hadn't expected was the response that would turn his peaceful existence upside down and uncover secrets that had been buried beneath the Arizona sand for over a decade. Jake had always been a man of few words, preferring the company of his horse Thunder to the chatter of townsfolk. At 35, he'd built a reputation as one of the most respected lawmen in the territory, known for his quick draw and even quicker thinking. But loneliness had a way of creeping into a man's bones like the desert cold, and after losing his first wife Mary to consumption 3 years prior, he'd finally worked up the courage to seek companionship through more unconventional means. The mail-order bride business was booming across the frontier, and Jake figured a quiet woman from back east might be exactly what his solitary life needed. The train from Kansas City was due at noon, carrying with it a woman named Catherine O'Malley. Her letters had been brief, polite, and reassuring in their simplicity. She claimed to be 28, well-educated but not overly talkative, and seeking a peaceful life away from the complications of city living. Jake had sent her enough money for passage and a modest wardrobe, along with a photograph of himself standing stoically outside the jailhouse. Everything seemed perfectly arranged for a quiet, civilized union. But as the whistle of the approaching locomotive pierced the desert air, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Old Pete, the station master, had been acting strange all morning, avoiding eye contact and mumbling under his breath. Even stranger was the fact that Doc Morrison had been seen lurking around the train station since dawn, which was unusual since the good doctor typically spent his mornings treating patients or nursing his bottle of whiskey. The train pulled into the station with a great hiss of steam and grinding of metal wheels. Jake straightened his vest and adjusted his hat, trying to look presentable for his bride-to-be. Passengers began disembarking, a traveling salesman with his sample cases, an elderly couple heading to visit relatives, a few cowboys returning from cattle drives. Then she appeared, and Jake's world tilted on its axis. Catherine O'Malley was nothing like he'd expected. Where he'd anticipated a demure, plainly dressed woman, he instead saw a vision in emerald green silk that seemed to catch every ray of desert sunlight. Her auburn hair was piled high beneath a feathered hat that probably cost more than most folks in Tombstone made in a month. But it wasn't her beauty that struck Jake speechless. It was the fact that he recognized her face from wanted posters that had crossed his desk just 2 months earlier. Marshal Hartwell, I presume? Her voice carried a slight Irish accent, musical and confident in a way that made Jake's pulse quicken, despite his growing suspicions. I'm Catherine, though my friends call me Kate. I do hope you don't mind that I've brought rather more luggage than anticipated. Behind her, 2 porters struggled with an enormous trunk that looked heavy enough to contain either a small fortune or a dead body. Jake's lawman instincts kicked into high gear as he noticed the nervous glances the porters exchanged and the way Kate's gloved hand hovered near a small reticule that bulged suspiciously. Ma'am, Jake tipped his hat, his voice carefully neutral. Welcome to Tombstone. I trust your journey was comfortable. Kate's laugh was like silver bells in a windstorm, beautiful but potentially dangerous. Oh, Marshal, comfortable is such a boring word. Don't you think? I prefer adventures that keep one on their toes. As she spoke, she moved closer to Jake, and he caught the scent of expensive perfume mixed with something else, something that reminded him of gunpowder. The ride to Jake's modest home on the outskirts of town was filled with Kate's animated chatter about her journey, the changing landscape, and her excitement about frontier life. But Jake noticed how her eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, cataloging every building, every person, every possible escape route. This was not the behavior of a simple woman seeking a quiet life. That evening, as Jake prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Kate explored his small house with the thoroughness of someone conducting reconnaissance. She examined his gun cabinet with particular interest, running her fingers along the barrels of his rifles with an expertise that no proper Eastern lady should possess. "You have quite an impressive collection, Marshal," she observed, hefting his prized Winchester with practiced ease. "This particular model can drop a man at 500 yards in the right hands." Jake paused in his cooking, a chill running down his spine. "That's not the kind of knowledge I'd expect from a schoolmarm from Kansas City." Kate's smile didn't falter, but something dangerous flickered in her green eyes. "Oh, Marshal, I never said I was a schoolmarm. A lady needs to know how to protect herself on the frontier, doesn't she?" Their first night as husband and wife was spent in separate rooms, with Jake claiming he wanted to be a gentleman and Kate expressing appreciation for his consideration. But in reality, Jake lay awake listening to the soft sounds of Kate moving around the house long after she should have been asleep. Around midnight, he heard the distinct click of his front door latch and saw through his window a shadowy figure slip out into the darkness. Jake waited 10 minutes before following, his bare feet silent on the wooden floors. The moonlight revealed Kate's path toward town, and Jake trailed her at a safe distance, using every bit of tracking skill he'd learned during his years as a lawman. She moved like a ghost through the back alleys of Tombstone, avoiding the main streets where drunken cowboys and late-night gamblers might spot her. She stopped at the rear entrance of the Occidental Saloon, one of the rougher establishments in town. Jake crept closer and positioned himself behind a stack of empty whiskey barrels, straining to hear the conversation taking place in the shadows. "You're late, Kate," a gravelly male voice complained. "We expected you yesterday." "Plans change, Dutch," Kate replied, her voice now stripped of its earlier sweetness. "The Marshal's more observant than we anticipated. This job might require more finesse than we originally planned." Jake's blood ran cold as the pieces began falling into place. Dutch, that had to be Dutch Morrison, Doc Morrison's ne'er-do-well brother who disappeared from town 3 months ago after being accused of cattle rustling. The family resemblance was strong enough that Jake should have recognized him immediately, but Dutch had grown a thick beard and lost considerable weight since his departure. "The bank job is set for Friday night," Dutch continued. "During the poker tournament when half the town's crowded into Murphy's saloon. Security will be minimal, and with you married to the Marshal, nobody will suspect his new bride of being involved." Kate laughed softly. "Brilliant plan. Assuming our dear Marshal doesn't figure out who I really am before then. He's been staring at me like he's trying to solve a puzzle. Who you really are." Dutch sounded confused. "You mean he doesn't know you're Kate Sullivan, the woman who robbed those banks in Colorado?" "Worse than that," Kate replied, and Jake could hear the smile in her voice. "He doesn't know I'm the woman who killed his predecessor, Marshal Tom Bradley, right here in Tombstone 18 months ago." The world seemed to stop spinning for Jake. Tom Bradley had been his mentor, the man who'd taught him everything about law enforcement and frontier justice. Tom's death had been ruled an accident, a fall from his horse during a routine patrol, but Jake had always harbored doubts about the circumstances. Tom was too experienced a rider to simply fall, and his horse Thunder, now Jake's mount, had been found miles away from Tom's body, uninjured and calm. "Bradley was getting too close to discovering our operation," Kate continued. "He'd started asking questions about the missing silver shipments, connecting them to my movements through the territory. I had to eliminate him before he could expose us." "And now you're married to his replacement," Dutch mused. "There's a certain poetic justice in that." "Justice is a luxury we can't afford." Kate's voice turned cold. "After we clean out the bank, I'll take care of Marshal Hartwell the same way I took care of Bradley. A tragic accident befalling the lawman's new bride will provide the perfect cover for our escape." Jake had heard enough. He carefully backed away from the saloon and made his way home, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. Kate had played her hand perfectly, too perfectly. She'd answered his advertisement not out of loneliness or desperation, but as part of an elaborate scheme to rob the Tombstone Bank and eliminate the only person who might be able to stop her. But Kate Sullivan had made one critical error. She'd underestimated Jake Hartwell. The next 3 days passed in a careful dance of deception. Kate continued playing the role of the eager new bride, filling Jake's house with laughter and conversation while secretly meeting with her accomplices each night. Jake pretended to be the besotted husband, all while quietly gathering evidence and forming his own plan to turn the tables on the woman who'd murdered his friend and mentor. Jake's first stop was to see Doc Morrison, Dutch's brother. He found the doctor in his office, examining a patient's broken arm with hands that shook slightly from his morning whiskey. "Doc, I need to ask you about your brother Dutch," Jake said after the patient had left. Doc Morrison's face went pale. "Dutch? I haven't seen Dutch in months. Last I heard, he was heading to California to try his luck in the goldfields." "That's interesting," Jake replied carefully, "because I have reason to believe he's been in the area recently, possibly involved in some activities that might interest a lawman." The doctor's hands began shaking more violently. "Marshall, I swear on my mother's grave, I don't know anything about Dutch's business. We haven't spoken since he left town after that cattle-rustling accusation." Jake studied the man's face carefully. Doc Morrison was many things: a drunk, a mediocre physician, a man of questionable ethics, but he wasn't a practiced liar. His fear and confusion seemed genuine. "Doc, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need an honest answer. Has anyone approached you recently asking about the bank's security procedures or the Marshall schedule?" Doc Morrison shook his head emphatically. "No, Marshall. Nothing like that. The only unusual thing lately has been that woman who's been asking questions about you around town." Jake's pulse quickened. "What woman?" "Pretty thing, well-dressed, claimed to be a journalist writing about frontier law enforcement. She was asking about your habits, where you patrol, what time you usually lock up the jail. I thought it was odd, but she seemed harmless enough." Jake felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Kate had been planning this operation for weeks, possibly months. She'd researched not just the town, but Jake specifically. The advertisement for a mail-order bride hadn't been a coincidence. It had been a carefully orchestrated trap. His next stop was the telegraph office, where Jake sent several coded messages to law enforcement contacts in Colorado, Kansas, and New Mexico. If Kate Sullivan had been operating across multiple territories, there would be a paper trail. Jake also sent a wire to the regional bank inspector, requesting information about any security concerns or threats to frontier banks. The responses began arriving within hours. Kate Sullivan was indeed wanted for bank robbery in 3 Colorado towns, but the descriptions of her accomplices didn't match Dutch Morrison. Instead, they described a tall, thin man with distinctive scars across his left cheek and a shorter, stockier partner with a pronounced limp. Jake was beginning to realize that the situation was far more complex than he'd initially believed. Kate wasn't just working with Dutch Morrison. She was part of a larger criminal organization that had been systematically targeting banks and law enforcement across the Western territories. On Thursday evening, Jake made his move. As Kate prepared for another of her midnight rendezvous, Jake was waiting in the shadows near the Occidental Saloon. But instead of hiding behind the whiskey barrels, he positioned himself on the roof of the adjacent building with a clear view and excellent acoustics. What he witnessed changed everything he thought he knew about the case. Kate arrived at the meeting spot as expected, but Dutch Morrison wasn't alone. With him were 2 other men, one tall and scarred, one shorter with a noticeable limp. These were Kate's real partners, the ones described in the Colorado wanted posters. "The marshal's getting suspicious," Kate reported without preamble. "He's been asking questions around town and sending telegraphs. We need to move the timeline up." The scarred man, clearly the leader, shook his head. "Impossible. The bank inspector arrives tomorrow for his quarterly review. The vault will be opened for a complete audit. It's the perfect opportunity to clean them out completely." "And if Hartwell figures out who you are before then?" Dutch asked. Kate smiled coldly. "Then Marshall Hartwell will meet with an unfortunate accident, just like Marshall Bradley did." "About Bradley," the scarred man interrupted. "You sure he's really dead?" "Dutch here says his brother saw someone matching Bradley's description in El Paso last month." Jake's world tilted again. Tom Bradley might still be alive? Kate waved dismissively. "Impossible. I shot him myself and threw his body in Devil's Canyon." The coyotes would have scattered his bones years ago. Maybe so, the scarred man replied. But Dutch's brother is a doctor. He knows what he saw. The conversation continued, but Jake's mind was reeling with new possibilities. If Tom Bradley was alive, it would explain why his body was never found despite extensive searches. It would also mean that Jake's entire understanding of the situation needed to be reconsidered. Jake carefully climbed down from his perch and made his way home, arriving well before Kate returned from her meeting. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and processing everything he'd learned. The bank robbery was scheduled for Friday night during the poker tournament. Kate was part of a larger criminal organization. Tom Bradley might still be alive, and somehow, Doc Morrison's brother had become entangled in the entire mess. Friday dawned clear and hot, with the kind of oppressive heat that made everyone in Tombstone move a little slower and think a little less clearly. Jake spent the morning making his final preparations, checking his weapons, and sending one last telegraph to his contacts in El Paso with a description of Tom Bradley and a request for immediate verification. The response arrived just as the sun was setting. Tom Bradley was alive and working as a sheriff in a small town outside El Paso under an assumed name. He'd been investigating the same criminal organization that Kate Sullivan belonged to when they tried to kill him. His survival and subsequent investigation had provided law enforcement with detailed information about the gang's operations across multiple territories. Jake smiled grimly as he pinned on his badge and checked his pocket watch. The poker tournament at Murphy's Saloon would be in full swing within the hour, providing the perfect cover for Kate's planned bank robbery. But Jake had his own surprise waiting. As he walked through the darkened streets toward the bank, Jake reflected on how perfectly Kate had played her role. She'd been the ideal bride, beautiful, charming, just mysterious enough to be intriguing without raising immediate suspicions. If he hadn't recognized her from the wanted posters, her plan might have worked perfectly. Jake positioned himself in the alley across from the bank and settled in to wait. Around 10 o'clock, he spotted movement in the shadows. Kate and her 3 accomplices approached the bank from different directions, moving with the practiced coordination of experienced criminals. Jake waited until they were all inside the building before making his move. Instead of confronting them directly, he crept to the rear of the bank and barricaded the back door with a heavy wooden beam. Then he moved to the front entrance and did the same thing. Kate Sullivan and her gang were now trapped inside the very building they'd intended to rob. Jake positioned himself across the street and called out in a voice that carried clearly through the desert air. "Kate Sullivan, this is Marshal Jake Hartwell. You and your accomplices are surrounded. Come out with your hands up, and nobody needs to get hurt." The response was immediate. A gunshot that shattered the bank's front window and sent Jake diving for cover behind a water trough. Kate's voice followed the gunshot, filled with fury and disbelief. "How did you know, Marshal? How long have you known?" "Long enough," Jake replied, drawing his Colt and keeping low. "I recognized you from the wanted posters the day you arrived. The question is, why did you kill Tom Bradley?" There was a long pause before Kate answered. "Because he was getting close to exposing our entire organization. We couldn't allow that." "Well, Kate, I have some bad news for you. Tom Bradley isn't dead. He's alive and well in El Paso, and he's been working with federal marshals to track down your gang." The silence from inside the bank stretched long enough that Jake began to worry they might be planning an escape through a window or basement entrance he hadn't considered. Then Kate's laughter echoed through the night, wild and slightly unhinged. "You're lying, Marshal. I shot him myself." "You shot at him," Jake corrected. "But Tom Bradley is harder to kill than you thought. Just like I'm going to be." What happened next unfolded with the speed and chaos of a desert thunderstorm. Kate and her gang began shooting through the windows, forcing Jake to move constantly to avoid their gunfire. But Jake had advantages they didn't. He knew every inch of Tombstone's layout. He had backup weapons cached at strategic locations around town, and most importantly, he had the moral authority of the law on his side. The gunfight lasted nearly an hour, with bullets flying through the night air and shattering windows throughout the business district. Jake used every trick Tom Bradley had taught him, moving from cover to cover, conserving ammunition, and slowly tightening the noose around the trapped criminals. The turning point came when Dutch Morrison attempted to escape through a side window. Jake was waiting for him and managed to wound him in the shoulder, sending him tumbling back into the bank with a cry of pain. The sight of their injured accomplice seemed to break the gang's morale. "Sullivan," the scarred man's voice carried through the broken windows, "this job's gone bad. We need to surrender before we all end up dead." "Never." Kate's reply was sharp and defiant. "I'd rather die fighting than hang from a rope." But Jake had one more card to play. Earlier that day, he'd sent word to the territorial governor requesting assistance. As Kate and her remaining accomplices debated their options, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the night air. 6 federal marshals rode into Tombstone like avenging angels, their badges glinting in the moonlight and their weapons ready for action. Leading them was a figure Jake recognized even in the darkness, Tom Bradley, very much alive and looking healthier than he had in years. "Jake!" Tom called out as he dismounted. "Good to see you're still in one piece. We got your telegraphs and came as fast as we could." The arrival of federal reinforcements ended the standoff quickly. Faced with overwhelming odds, Kate's accomplices threw down their weapons and surrendered. But Kate Sullivan herself made one final, desperate play. She emerged from the bank holding a stick of dynamite with a lit fuse, her green eyes wild with desperation and defiance. "Stay back," she screamed. "I'll blow us all to hell before I let you take me alive." Jake stepped forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Kate, it's over. Don't make this worse than it already is." "Worse?" She laughed bitterly. "Marshall, you have no idea how bad things really are. This bank job was just the beginning. We've been planning something much bigger, something that would have made us rich beyond your wildest imagination." Tom Bradley moved to Jake's side, his own weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. "Kate Sullivan, I'm placing you under federal arrest for bank robbery, attempted murder, and conspiracy. Drop the dynamite and surrender peacefully." Kate's eyes widened as she recognized Tom. "You! But I killed you. I saw you fall into Devil's Canyon." Tom smiled grimly. "You saw me fall, Kate, but the canyon wasn't as deep as you thought. I survived, and I've been tracking you and your organization ever since. Did you really think you were the only one capable of playing a long game?" The revelation that Tom had been alive and working undercover for over a year seemed to break something inside Kate. She looked around at the circle of lawmen surrounding her, at the dynamite in her hands, and at Jake, the man she tried to deceive and ultimately destroy. "You want to know the truth, Marshall Hartwell?" she asked, her voice suddenly calm and eerily quiet. "You want to know why I really answered your advertisement?" Jake nodded, keeping his eyes fixed on the sputtering fuse of the dynamite stick. "Because my organization has been planning to rob the territorial capital's bank vault, the one that holds the silver reserves for the entire Arizona territory. We needed someone inside law enforcement, someone we could manipulate and control. Your lonely little advertisement was the perfect opportunity." She paused, her smile turning cruel. "But you turned out to be more difficult to manipulate than we anticipated. So we decided to eliminate you and find a more cooperative replacement." Tom Bradley stepped forward. "Kate, that fuse is getting awfully short. You've got maybe 30 seconds before that dynamite explodes." Kate looked down at the dynamite in her hands, then back at the assembled lawmen. For a moment, Jake thought she was going to surrender. Instead, she smiled one last time and spoke words that would haunt him for years to come. "Some secrets are worth dying for, Marshall, and some truths are too dangerous to let live." She threw the dynamite high into the air, away from the crowd of lawmen but close enough that the explosion would still be devastating. Jake didn't think, he simply reacted, drawing his Colt and firing a single, perfect shot that detonated the dynamite safely in midair. The explosion lit up the night sky like a miniature sun, and when the smoke and debris settled, Kate Sullivan was gone. In the confusion following the blast, she'd managed to slip away into the maze of Tombstone's back alleys. Jake organized search parties immediately, but Kate seemed to have vanished like smoke in the desert wind. They found evidence that she'd stolen a horse from the livery stable and headed north toward the mountains. But the trail went cold in the rocky terrain beyond town. Tom Bradley and the federal marshals remained in Tombstone for 3 more days, interviewing Kate's captured accomplices and gathering evidence about the larger criminal organization. What they learned was both fascinating and terrifying. Kate Sullivan had been part of a sophisticated network of criminals that operated across the entire western frontier. They specialized in long-term infiltration schemes, placing operatives in positions of trust within communities before striking at banks, mines, and government installations. Kate's marriage to Jake had been just one small part of a much larger plan that involved robbing territorial treasuries and disrupting federal law enforcement across multiple states. Dutch Morrison, it turned out, had been coerced into cooperating with the gang after they threatened to kill his brother Document. The scarred man and his limping partner were career criminals with connections to outlaw gangs as far away as Texas and California. As the federal marshals prepared to leave Tombstone with their prisoners, Tom Bradley pulled Jake aside for a private conversation. "Jake, I owe you an apology," Tom began. "I should have found a way to let you know I was alive. But the federal marshals convinced me that maintaining my cover was essential to breaking up this criminal network." Jake shook his head. "Tom, you did what you had to do. I'm just glad you're alive and that we managed to stop Kate's gang." "Most of them," Tom corrected. "Kate Sullivan is still out there somewhere. And she's more dangerous now than ever. She knows we're onto her organization, and she'll be looking for revenge." Tom's words proved prophetic. Over the following months, reports began filtering in from across the territory of a woman matching Kate's description involved in various criminal activities. She seemed to be systematically targeting anyone connected to the Tombstone operation, seeking revenge against those who had thwarted her plans. Jake received several threatening letters, always signed simply K, and promising that their business was far from finished. He took the threats seriously but refused to let fear dictate his actions. Tombstone needed a strong marshal, and Jake was determined to provide that leadership regardless of personal risk. 6 months after the bank job that never was, Jake received word that Kate Sullivan had been captured in Santa Fe while attempting to rob a silver convoy. She was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Jake felt a sense of closure knowing that Tom Bradley's attempted murderer had finally been brought to justice. But even in prison, Kate Sullivan continued to cast a shadow over Jake's life. Prison guards reported that she spent her time writing letters and receiving visitors, apparently maintaining contact with criminal associates throughout the region. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Kate was still planning something, still working toward some larger goal that her capture had only temporarily delayed. 1 year to the day after Kate's arrival in Tombstone, Jake stood on his front porch watching the sunrise paint the desert mountains gold and purple. He thought about the events that had transformed his quiet life into something resembling a dime novel adventure. He'd sought a quiet bride, and instead found himself entangled with one of the most dangerous criminals in the territory. Thunder nickered softly from the corral, and Jake walked over to give his horse some sugar cubes. The animal had been Tom Bradley's mount before becoming his, and Jake sometimes wondered if Thunder remembered those harrowing days when Tom had been presumed dead. As Jake prepared for another day of maintaining law and order in Tombstone, he reflected on the lessons he'd learned from his brief, disastrous marriage to Kate Sullivan. Trust was precious and hard-earned. Appearances could be devastatingly deceiving, and sometimes the quiet life a man thought he wanted wasn't nearly as important as the exciting, dangerous, meaningful life he was actually living. The mail-order bride advertisement he'd placed in the Denver Post had brought him more adventure than he'd bargained for, but it had also taught him something valuable about himself. Jake Hartwell wasn't meant for quiet domesticity. He was meant to stand between civilization and chaos, to protect the innocent from predators like Kate Sullivan, and to ensure that justice prevailed on the frontier. 6 months later, Jake received a letter that would once again turn his world upside down. It was from the warden at the territorial prison, informing him that Kate Sullivan had escaped during a prisoner transport. She'd killed 2 guards and wounded a third before disappearing into the New Mexico wilderness. The letter also included a message that Kate had asked the warden to deliver personally. "Tell Marshal Hartwell that our dance isn't finished. I promised him a quiet life, and I always keep my promises. He'll understand what that means soon enough." Jake set the letter down and checked his weapons automatically. Somewhere out in the vast expanse of the American Southwest, the most dangerous woman he'd ever met was free and planning her return to Tombstone. The town that had been peaceful for over a year was about to become the stage for the final confrontation between a dedicated lawman and the criminal mastermind who tried to destroy everything he held dear. As Jake pinned on his badge that morning, he found himself almost looking forward to Kate's return. Their first encounter had been a game of deception and misdirection, with both parties playing roles designed to fool the other. Their next meeting would be different. No pretenses, no false identities, just a straightforward confrontation between two people who understood each other far too well. The quiet bride Jake had wanted no longer existed, if she ever had. In her place was a dangerous adversary who had taught him that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for personal happiness, but for the safety and security of entire communities. Kate Sullivan had awakened something in Jake Hartwell that he hadn't known existed, a willingness to sacrifice his own peace of mind for the greater good. As he walked through the streets of Tombstone that morning, greeting shop owners and checking on the local businesses, Jake couldn't help but smile. His life hadn't turned out anything like he'd planned, but it had turned out exactly like it was supposed to. The advertisement for a quiet bride had brought him the loudest, most dangerous, most challenging opponent he could have imagined. And when Kate Sullivan finally returned to Tombstone for their inevitable final confrontation, Jake Hartwell would be ready and waiting. The cowboy who'd wanted quiet had learned to appreciate the loud, chaotic, dangerous beauty of a life spent in service to justice. Kate had taught him that lesson, and for that he was almost grateful. The sun climbed higher over the Arizona desert, casting sharp shadows between the buildings of Tombstone and promising another day of heat, dust, and the endless struggle between order and chaos that defined life on the American frontier.